Hi guys, welcome back again. G-Economics here. So we are working through these potential paper questions. So far we've considered distinguish between short run and long run economic growth for 4 marks. And we are currently looking at analyse the reasons why the UK's economic recovery may not be sustainable. In the pre-release material, we've considered John Van Reenen's comments. We've considered point number 1 with regard to long-term unemployment. And we have mentioned the fact that you really want to be including the term hysteresis in your answer. Very important term to get into an answer, I feel. And we've considered the aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis that we would need. So let's consider the second point, a very interesting point that Van Reenen makes, that there is a fall in the employment rate from 73 to 71 despite the rise in employment. So it's a sort of tricky one to get your head around. Do make sure that you know the definition of employment rate. So we're talking about the number of people of working age currently in employment. So let's just have a little look at this. So if we take this example, here we've got an economy with 10 people of working age. If one of those people is working, then we can say that there is an employment rate of 10%. Now, Van Reenen says that the number of people in employment, so we're considering this, has gone up from 1, it's gone up, so I'm going to increase it to 5. But he's also said that as a percentage of the overall total number of people in employment, this percentage is fallen in our example from 73 to 71. So I'm going to say that this needs to go from 10% down to 5%. Well, if this is 5 and this is 5%, then this number, ladies and gentlemen, the number of people of working age who are in employment has to go up to 100. So the key problem in this instance is that the number of people in the economy of working age has gone up. Now there are a few reasons that may cause that. Obviously migration into the economy, if you've got a lot of people coming into the economy of working age, that could be a possibility. It could be maybe something to do with the age rate at which government says, well, you can retire later or you can start work earlier, and of course that would elongate and increase the number of people of working age. But the problem here is, of course, in this instance we've got 9 people unemployed, whereas in this instance we have 95 people unemployed. And so in terms of our ADAS analysis that you may wish to include alongside of that, you may then be saying, well, actually, in that instance, get the AD curve on, in that instance, we've got all these people, now 95 people, rather than in the first example it was 9 people unemployed. So we've got more people in receipt of some type of benefit, and as a consequence of that, their ability to spend falls. Therefore, AD potentially shifting to the left, and as a consequence of that, it puts a dampener and it puts a brake on the ability of the economy to grow. And just referring back to the question, analyse the reasons why the UK's economic recovery may not be sustainable. So it's not sustainable, obviously, if you keep having a larger and larger pool of labour which is not in employment. There is, of course, an opportunity cost that goes alongside of that, because, of course, if you are spending so much more income on some type of unemployment related benefit, then the amount of money that you have, let's say, for an infrastructure project such as HS2, for example, that will also fall, and therefore the derived demand for labour in that respect would fall, and therefore the amount of employment would fall. So opportunity cost is a term which you may wish to include in your answer. And of course, keep referring back to your diagrams when you're doing your analysis of this. So that's what Van Reenen says. We then move on in the case study, and we have a few comments to follow then, which are made by David Blanchflower. Now, I want to go over these fairly briefly because they are fairly straightforward, so I don't want to spend too long on these, but just to consider how these would also be constraints on growth. So we see here, I see little prospect that this growth rate will be sustained into the future despite what George Osborne says. There is scant evidence that any of the four components of growth are at blast-off stage. Okay, so there's some fairly straightforward analysis we could do once again. So we know that AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. We've just read that none of these are at so-called blast-off stage. And as a consequence of that, we are unlikely, it's not impossible, but we are unlikely to see very significant shifts in AD from AD1 to AD2 to AD3. Unlikely to see massive shifts in AD, shifting to the right, and causing, of course, what we're looking for here, which is growth from Y1 to Y3. And so that is putting a little bit of a dampener and a little bit of a brake on growth. And at the end of that particular paragraph it says, net business lending continues to fall. Now this, once again, ladies and gentlemen, is an interesting point. Businesses need to borrow money for the I component of AD. Now, as you know, I, in terms of AD, is investment by firms on capital goods. Now, it might be new capital goods and it might be replacement capital goods, replacing machines which have worn out. Well, let's just consider if these countries, and it's the UK in this instance, if the UK did not replace worn out machinery, the productive potential, the productive capacity of the UK economy will fall. And as a consequence, the KAS curve, because the KAS curve shows our YF position, it shows our maximum productive potential, the KAS curve may shift to the left. So we've got a supply side issue there in terms of net business lending, but we've also got a demand side problem as well, because of course C plus I plus G plus X minus M. If businesses are doing less investment, so we've got a reduction on this side of our AD equation, then clearly the overall total AD will be falling, and that as well will be shifting AD1 across to AD2. I think it's important, ladies and gentlemen, that you perhaps in your answers refer to, when you're explaining your diagrams like this and you're explaining how we might end up moving from initial equilibrium here at point A to final equilibrium here at point B, don't forget to include reference to the negative multiplier. I think it's important that you illustrate and demonstrate to the examiner that you acknowledge and you understand and you know that the multiplier not only does it work in an upwards positive direction, but it also works in a downwards direction. So for example, if the government pulls out 10 billion from the economy, then the actual contraction in terms of real output Y might be 20 billion or 30 billion, 40 billion, depending upon the size of the negative multiplier. So don't be afraid to include all of these terms, And you know, the exam, this is your opportunity to show off to the examiner. So show off, tell them all that you know. Back to our case study. Next little paragraph, we've got a little factor here which is explaining the fact that 0.7% is due to investment in the Olympics in contrast with the same period, but most fast forecasters are not expecting much, if any, growth in the second half of the year. So you could, in your analysis, put the very positive statements at the beginning of this extract down to the very significant and positive but temporary, and I think the key thing here is that it is temporary, the very temporary nature of the building projects and so on that surrounded the Olympics. Don't be afraid to include terms like derived demand. So when you're building new venues for the Olympics, what do you need? Well, this is a major project, so you need labour, and so there's a temporary increase in the demand for labour. But obviously, once these things are built, once the Olympics has been and gone, a lot of these people who were previously employed, they're no longer employed. And so that really puts a drag on aggregate demand, because they may be unable to get other jobs elsewhere, and therefore also acting as a constraint on the economy. Next point. The economy that Osborne inherited was growing at 0.6% a quarter, etc., etc. No, the key thing here is the austerity policy, which is mentioned. So when we're talking about austerity, which David Cameron, of course, has been doing since 2010, and George Osborne, as they attempt to reduce the enormous debt that the UK is suffering from. When we're talking about austerity, we mean that the G component is going to be reduced and the T component is going to be increased, if they were to do both of those things, to really go hard at austerity. Obviously, both of those things constitute a very significant withdrawal from, you could call it the circular flow of income if you wanted to include that term, but it represents a very significant withdrawal from the UK economy. And yet again, the AD reference here is important, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So the G component here is going to be falling. And let's not forget T, taxation. Now that could be taxation falling on businesses in the form of corporation tax, although corporation tax has been cut. So it's more likely to be falling on the employee, and hence consumption levels are more likely to fall. And as a consequence of falling consumption levels, again, we could be doing similar analysis in terms of AD1 shifting to AD2, putting all the equilibrium points on and so on, talking once again, ladies and gentlemen, let's reiterate once again, talking about the negative multiplier. Again, a constraint on the growth of the economy. And then, moving on, we now turn our attentions to the views of Liam Halligan. And again, his views are equally sort of depressing, really. But again, he's talking about factors which will constrain growth. Real wages continue to fall as inflation erodes purchasing power. Interesting point. So real wages, you need to know obviously what real wages are. So the real wage tells you how many goods and services you can buy with your income at a given price level. And the equation for it is usually simply W over P. W being your money wage, and P being the price level. So, for example, let's say you earn £100 a week and you're buying goods and services which are priced at £25 each. Well, obviously in that case, you could buy 4 of them. Well, if your money wage remains at £100, yet inflation is rising, so let's say now the prices are 50, now you have the same amount of money, but your basket of goods is only 2 goods, whereas previously it was 4 goods. Again, what is that going to hinder? It's going to hinder AD. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. It's going to hinder the C component. Consumption levels falling, back to the same analysis, AD curve shifting to the left. And think of your public sector employees such as myself, teachers haven't really had any increases worth talking about in terms of their money wage for several years, yet inflation and price levels have continued to go up. And as Liam Halligan says, that erodes your purchasing power and hence means that you're able to buy less and hence puts the brakes on and puts a constraint on growth. Next point, there has been no sign of rebalancing away from consumption towards exports and investment. Back in 2010, Osborne declared his confidence in a march of the makers, claiming that manufacturers would power growth via a surge in exports. It hasn't happened. Right. This one, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's all AD sort of stuff that we're looking at here. So a rebalancing of the economy. The UK economy is predominantly driven by consumption, and the consumption element makes up around about in the UK 60% of AD. Now, that's okay when the economy is growing and things are going well, but when we've had such a severe economic depression as we've had in the last 8 years or so, and consumers are uncertain about their jobs, and people are losing their jobs, and people don't want to go out and spend money, they want to keep money for a rainy day, you can no longer rely on consumption for growth, and you need to switch it to one of your other components. Now, Halligan is saying here that this switch and this so-called rebalancing away from consumption and towards exports and investment, he is saying that this hasn't happened. And therefore, in an economy where we can no longer rely on the consumption element for growth, well, if the switch hasn't been made to investment and exports either, we can't rely on those 2 factors to drive growth either. Therefore, again, that helps to put the brakes on growth, and same old in terms of analysis, AD will stagnate or potentially shift to the left. Okay, next point, interesting point about the currency depreciation. Despite the pound falling some 20% against our main trading partners, UK exports have slumped. 20% reduction in the exchange rate. So we've had a 20% depreciation of sterling. You ought to know that, and this is certainly a simple way to remember it, just remember that the price of exports always move in the same direction as the currency. So if the currency depreciates, the price of exports fall, and vice versa. So we can say here that the price of exports, PX, has fallen. Now, normally, one would, and that's not normally, let's use the appropriate language, ceteris paribus. So under normal circumstances, because this is a micro diagram, because the demand curve slopes downwards from left to right, when the price falls from P1 to P2, the quantity demanded, one would expect, all other things remaining equal, which is what ceteris paribus means, one would expect the demand for exports to go up. But what Halligan is saying here is that this hasn't happened. And why hasn't it happened, ladies and gentlemen? Well, where's our major export partner? Our major export partner is this place here. So this is the UK, this is Europe. Our major export destination is Europe. You ought to know about the European economy, what's happening in terms of Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, the so-called pig nations. Greece in particular at the minute, obviously, very close to bankruptcy really. Well, if they are in big diffs in terms of their economy, they're not going to be buying our exports, and again, that puts the brakes on our ability to grow. That puts the brakes on our aggregate demand. Further constraining the growth of the UK economy. And remember that exports are what's known as an autonomous variable. So there's Y, real income, and exports. So we tend to say that exports tend not to be affected so much by the level of our own domestic income, but by the level of incomes abroad. And obviously, if incomes abroad are stagnating or falling, they're less likely to buy our exports, and therefore our aggregate demand is more likely to fall, and all of the analysis which you would obviously include after that. And then the final point, which brings us to the end of extract 1, is with regard to the fact that our growth is constrained because we are under the burden of so much debt, the national debt. So you'll know that the national debt for the UK economy is around about 1.5 trillion. A number which we cannot even get our heads around, 1.5 trillion. David Cameron, George Osborne, they're trying to limit the rate at which this is growing every year by shrinking the budget deficit, which links into the austerity point made by Blanchflower in the previous page of the extract. And if you are servicing an enormous debt like that, well, debt interest alone is around about 50 billion a year. Well, there's 50 billion which you're taking out of the savings pot, out of the money pot, and it's not available to spend on things like health, education, increasing teacher salaries, that type of thing. And as a consequence of that, that is all obviously going to put a brake on growth. So there is, with that debt, there is obviously an enormous opportunity cost, because we're servicing that debt. It's costing us an absolute arm and a leg. I think it's going up by something like, the national debt figure goes up by around about £5,000 a second. It's quantities which the normal person, we just cannot comprehend these numbers, but we know it's big, and we know it's a problem, and we know it's a bit of a constraint on growth, because there would be an extra 50 billion that we could be investing in all types of infrastructure projects, which would create an enormous derived demand for goods and services of all types, which would help to grow our economy. And so that would be my thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, on extract 1. So in terms of the questions then, we've just got to, so we've done this one, and now we're on to 1C, which is moving on to, I think it's moving on to the next extract. So it's moving on to extract 2. So I'm just going to have a break for 5 minutes and then I'll come back to this one.